The moment Violet Conley stepped off the westbound train at Harlow, Kansas in the spring of 1878, she pulled the pins from her hair and let it fall loose around her shoulders right there on the platform. And not a single soul who watched her do it understood that they were witnessing a woman being born for the second time. She had come from Baltimore, Maryland, where the air smelled of coal smoke and old money and expectation, where every room she had ever lived in had walls that seemed to lean inward, pressing closer year by year. She was 23 years old, and she had spent the better part of those years being told what a woman of her station ought to do, what she ought to wear, what she ought to say, and most importantly, who she ought to marry. The man her father had chosen for her was a banker named Aldous Farrell, 41 years old, with a thick neck and small eyes, and a habit of finishing her sentences before she had a chance to say what she actually meant. She had sat across from him at dinner tables for 6 months. She had smiled when she was supposed to smile. And then one morning in February, with ice still laced along the window glass and the city silent and gray, she had written a letter to her father, packed one trunk and one leather satchel, withdrawn every cent of the small inheritance left to her by her grandmother, and walked out the front door of the Conley house on Calvert Street without looking back once. She did not feel guilty. She felt the way a river must feel when the dam finally gives way. Harlow was not the end of her journey. She had read advertisements in newspapers about the open land of the Kansas plains, about towns growing up from nothing, about the kind of life where a person's worth was measured in what they could do rather than who they were born to. She had a plan, modest but real. She would find a town with a schoolhouse because she had been well educated despite everything, and she would offer her services as a teacher. She would find a room in a boarding house. She would live on her own terms. What she had not planned for was the dust. The main street of Harlow was unpaved, and a wind came rolling in from the west the moment she stepped onto it, carrying enough grit to sting her cheeks and fill the folds of her traveling dress in seconds. She squinted through it and saw a row of wooden storefronts, a livery stable, a general store, a saloon with bat-wing doors, and at the far end, what looked like it might once have been a schoolhouse but currently had one wall missing and a family of pigeons roosting in the rafters. She stood there with her trunk at her feet and her satchel over her shoulder, and took a long, slow breath of the dusty air, and she smiled. A man leading 2 horses past her on the street gave her a puzzled look. She did not explain herself to him. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Pauline Greer, who was somewhere in her 50s, had forearms like a blacksmith, and served the best beef stew Violet had ever tasted. She gave Violet a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced west, so that every evening the sunset came in like something painted by a man who had decided to show off. Mrs. Greer did not ask Violet many questions the first night, which Violet appreciated enormously. She asked enough to establish that Violet was not running from the law and was not carrying a disease, and then she poured them both a cup of tea, and they sat in a comfortable silence that felt, to Violet, like a small miracle. In the morning she went to speak to the mayor of Harlow, a heavy-set man named Josiah Plum who wore a brown waistcoat and had the manner of someone perpetually surprised by his own importance. He told her, after she had explained her qualifications, that the town had indeed been without a schoolteacher for the past 4 months, that the schoolhouse was in need of some repair, and that the pay would be modest. She told him the pay was fine. He seemed vaguely unsettled by how directly she looked at him when she said this, as though he had expected her to flutter or defer, and she watched him recalibrate and decide she would do. The schoolhouse took 2 weeks to get into working order. She did some of the repair work herself, which drew considerable commentary from the townspeople, who seemed to regard a woman holding a hammer as approximately as strange as a fish riding a horse. She ignored the commentary and fixed the wall. It was during the 3rd week, when she had a dozen children seated on the rough-hewn benches she had arranged, and was in the middle of a geography lesson, pointing out the Mississippi River on a battered map she had brought from Baltimore, that she first saw Cecil Vaughn. He rode past the open schoolhouse door on a chestnut quarter horse, moving at a walk, and something made her look up at exactly that moment. She registered a tall man in a battered hat, broad through the shoulders, and then the horse carried him past, and she went back to the Mississippi River and her students. She did not think about him again that day. She thought about him the following morning when she was at the general store owned by a man named Reuben Farr, selecting flour and dried beans and a tin of coffee. And the same tall man in the same battered hat came through the door, and Reuben Farr said, with the warmth of long familiarity, "Cecil Vaughn, you are 2 days late with that fence wire." The man called Cecil took his hat off when he came inside, which she noticed because not every man in Harlow did, and he had dark hair that was pressed flat in a ring around his head from the hat's band, and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that she would later find herself comparing, privately and with some annoyance at herself, to creek water in October. He was perhaps 27 or 28, she thought. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been outdoors for most of its existence, weathered and honest, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and a mouth that suggested something else entirely. But she shut that observation down before it got anywhere useful. He apologized to Reuben Farr about the fence wire in a voice that was unhurried and low, and then he turned and saw her standing beside the flour barrels, and he nodded once, the way people in the West seemed to greet each other, economical and direct. She nodded back. He bought his wire and a sack of oats and left. Reuben Farr watched him go and then looked at Violet with the expression of a man preparing to impart information. "That's Cecil Vaughn," he said. "Runs the Vaughn ranch out about 6 miles east of town. Good man, quiet, keeps to himself mostly since his father passed. You're the new teacher, aren't you?" "I am," she said. "Well," said Reuben Farr, apparently satisfied with this exchange, "those beans are fresh in from last week." She would not have thought anything further about Cecil Vaughn except that the following Saturday she went to the corral at the edge of town, where a man named Gus Whittaker was selling horses, because she had decided she needed to learn to ride if she was going to live in Kansas and not be entirely dependent on other people to carry her from one place to another. She had ridden side saddle as a girl, under duress and with a groom leading the horse, which she did not count. Cecil Vaughn was also at the corral. He was standing with his arms resting on the top rail, watching a gray mare circle the enclosure, and he had the look of a man who had been watching horses long enough that he could see things in their movement that other people missed. Violet stood on the other side of the rail and watched the same mare and tried to see what he was seeing. After a while he said, without looking at her, "She favors her left foreleg just slightly. Probably nothing serious, but worth knowing." She looked at the mare again and watched her, and after a moment she saw it, the faintest hitch in the stride, barely perceptible. "I see it now," she said. He glanced over at her then. "You're the schoolteacher," he said. "Violet Conley," she said. "Cecil Vaughn." He said it without the self-importance some men put into their names, just information offered plainly. "I know," she said. "Reuben Farr told me." The corner of his mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Reuben tells everyone everything," he said. "It's the closest thing to a newspaper this town has." She laughed at that, and he looked at her with what she thought was mild surprise, as though he had not entirely expected her to find him funny. She told him she was hoping to buy a horse and learn to ride properly. He asked her what she meant by properly, and she told him she could manage a side saddle with a handler leading the horse, but that this did not seem to her like actually riding, and she wanted to ride the way people rode out here, with the horse doing what she asked it to do because she knew how to ask it. He considered this for a moment, looking at her steadily, and then he said, "Gus Whittaker will sell you a horse that'll carry you fine, but if you want to know how to actually ride it, that's a different matter." "What sort of matter?" she asked. "Time," he said, "and patience, mostly yours, a little the horse's." "I have both," she said. He nodded. "Then I expect you'll manage." He did not offer to help her, not that day. She bought a horse anyway, a steady bay mare of about 7 years that Gus Whittaker said was good-natured and forgiving, which Violet figured was what she needed in a horse at this stage of her equestrian career. She named the horse Mabel, which made Reuben Farr's wife, who had come to see the transaction, press her lips together in the way that indicated she thought this was eccentric. She was halfway home, riding somewhat uncertainly but maintaining her seat, when she heard hoofbeats behind her and Cecil Vaughn pulled up alongside on his chestnut horse. He rode the way men out here seemed to ride, easy and unconscious, as if the horse were an extension of himself rather than a separate animal he was borrowing. "You're gripping with your knees," he said. "Is that wrong? It's tense. She can feel it. Try to sit down into the saddle more. Think about your weight going down through the stirrups rather than up into your knees." She tried it. The difference was immediate and odd, as though the mare beneath her relaxed a degree. "That's better," he said. They rode in silence for a stretch, the spring grass rolling on either side of the road, green and vivid against the wide blue sky. She had not expected Kansas to be beautiful. She had expected it to be open, which it was, but she had not expected the particular beauty of a flat landscape under an enormous sky, the way it made a person feel simultaneously small and expanded, as though the chest had more room in it. "You're not from here," he said. It was not a question. "Baltimore," she said. He absorbed this the way he seemed to absorb most information, without visible reaction. "Long way," he said. "That was rather the idea," she said. He looked at her sideways, and this time the corner of his mouth moved further, and she decided it was definitely the beginning of a smile, and that she found this more interesting than she was prepared to deal with at present. He turned off the road toward his ranch about a mile before town, lifting 2 fingers from the brim of his hat in farewell. She rode the rest of the way to Mrs. Greer's boarding house, thinking about how she had come west to be free, and how freedom, apparently, had a very particular kind of face and October Creekwater eyes. She did not think this was the universe being helpful. She thought it was the universe being contrary, and she proceeded accordingly. The weeks that followed were the fullest she had ever lived. She taught school from Monday through Friday, 7 children at first and then 11, ranging in age from 6 to 14, teaching reading and arithmetic and geography and a little bit of history. And she loved it in a way she had never loved anything that had been arranged for her, because it was hers. She had found it and made it work with her own determination, and it belonged to her in the way that only things you have truly chosen can belong to you. On Saturday mornings she practiced riding. She did this mostly alone at first, taking Mabel out along the flat road east of town, working on what Cecil had told her about weight and seat and not gripping. She got better quickly, because she was determined, and because Mabel was indeed patient and forgiving. Sometimes she encountered Cecil on these rides, because his ranch was in that direction, and he was usually doing something that required him to be on a horse, moving cattle or checking fence lines or carrying something from one part of his property to another. When they met, he would ride alongside her for a stretch and occasionally offer a piece of instruction, always specific, always useful, never condescending. She noticed that he was one of the very few people she had met who did not explain things to her, as though she were probably too simple to understand them without extra help. He said what a thing was and trusted her to take it from there. She told him this one afternoon when they had stopped by a creek to let the horses drink, the water running clear and quick over a bed of pale stones. She told him she appreciated that he did not treat her like she needed everything spelled out twice. He looked at her with a level expression. "Why would I?" he said. "Because most men do," she said. He considered this. "Well," he said, "most men are fools." She laughed so suddenly that it surprised both of them, and this time he smiled fully, a real smile that changed his face considerably and made something happen in the vicinity of her chest that she catalogued as a physiological response to sudden amusement, and not anything more significant than that. It was at the creek that she told him, for the first time, why she had come west. She did not plan to tell him. It came out of the easy silence between them, which had by now become a comfortable thing rather than an awkward one. And she found herself speaking about Baltimore and her father and Aldous Farrell and the walls of the Conley house pressing inward. And she spoke plainly, without self-pity, because she did not feel sorry for herself. She felt fortunate to have gotten out. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had noticed about him, that he listened the way he watched horses, with real attention. When she was finished, he said, "So you came west to be free?" "Yes," she said, simply and completely. That was exactly it. He was quiet for a moment, watching the water move over the stones. Then he looked at her and said, "Then I will never cage you." She stared at him. He said it with the same directness he said everything, not as a declaration of romantic intention, not as a promise extracted from him by circumstances, but as a simple statement of how things were going to be. As though he had looked at who she was and who he was and understood without drama that this was what she needed from anyone who was going to matter to her. She did not know what to do with this. She had not expected it. She had grown up among men who saw freedom in a woman as a problem to be solved, a tendency to be redirected, a phase to be waited out. She had never heard a man say what Cecil Vaughn had just said, and she had certainly never heard one say it so quietly and completely, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't know me well enough to promise that," she said, because she did not want to be undone by a sentence, even a sentence like that one. "I know you well enough," he said. The horses drank, the creek ran, the big Kansas sky sat over them like a blessing. She rode home alone, which she preferred. She sat with his words for the rest of that day, and into the evening, and she decided that she would not do anything foolish or impulsive. She had only been in Harlow for 6 weeks. She had come west for herself, not for a man, and she was not going to let the first quietly extraordinary man she encountered throw her off course before she had even truly begun. She held to this resolution for about 3 more weeks, and then she let it go, because it had become less a resolution than a pretense, and she had never had much patience for pretense. What broke it was the cattle drive. In May, Cecil's hired hands drove a portion of his herd to Dodge City for sale, which was one of the great cattle drives still happening along the Kishom Trail system in that period, and 2 of the hands came back reporting that a third hand, a young man named Daniel Purdy who had been with Cecil for 2 years, had been badly injured in a river crossing. He had made it to Dodge City and was being cared for but could not ride back for some weeks. She heard about this from Mrs. Greer, who heard it from the hands at the saloon, and she thought of Cecil alone on his ranch with 2 hands down to 1, because his other regular hand, a man named Otis, was older and had a bad hip, and did the slower work around the property. She thought about it for half a day, and then she rode out to the Vaughn ranch on Mabel, feeling slightly ridiculous but going anyway. The ranch was plainer than she had imagined. A low house of good timber with a covered porch, a solid barn, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that needed attention. Cecil was mending harness in front of the barn when she rode up, and he looked at her with an expression that was both surprised and not surprised, which she found characteristic of him. "I heard about Daniel Purdy," she said. "I thought I might help for a few days." He squinted up at her from his crouch beside the harness. "Help how?" he said. "Whatever needs doing," she said. "I can cook. I can mend. I am becoming competent with a horse. I have my students through Friday, but I am free in the mornings before school and on the weekends." He was quiet for a moment. He did not tell her she could not do it because she was a woman. He did not tell her it was not suitable or appropriate or that people would talk. He just looked at her steadily for a few seconds, calculating honestly rather than politically, and then he said, "That kitchen garden is behind." "I noticed," she said. "And I am behind on about 6 other things," he said. "Then I will help with them," she said. She climbed down from Mabel and tied her at the fence post and rolled up her sleeves, and they worked side by side for the rest of that afternoon. She in the kitchen garden and he finishing the harness, and then moving to a fence section that needed new posts. They worked with the easy competence of two people who are both accustomed to doing things rather than talking about doing things. And when the light got long and gold in the late afternoon, she was aware of him moving around the property and of herself moving around it as well, and of the way these movements had a kind of naturalness to them that she had not felt before in relation to any person or any place. He made coffee and they sat on the porch steps with it, watching the evening come over the flat land in long pink and orange waves. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, not suspiciously, just honestly wanting to know. She thought about it for a real moment rather than a polite one. "Because I think you are a good man and it seemed right," she said, "and because I wanted to." He looked at her, that level, honest look that she had come to know over the past weeks. "All right," he said, and that was all. She rode home in the blue dusk with something warm and serious in her chest, and this time she did not try to name it anything other than what it was. She came back on Saturday morning. She came back the following Saturday. The Saturdays became a habit, and then the Saturdays and some Wednesday evenings when the school day was over early. And within another month she was at the Vaughn ranch more weekends than not, and the townspeople of Harlow were definitely discussing it in the way small towns discuss everything, which was with thorough interest and varying degrees of approval. Mrs. Greer told her one evening over supper that people were talking. She said it without judgment, offering information. Violet said, "What are they saying?" Mrs. Greer said that you and Cecil Vaughn are keeping company. Violet considered this. "I suppose that's accurate," she said, Mrs. Greer looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who had seen a great deal of life and found most of it less complicated than people made it. "He's a good man," she said. "His father was a good man. The mother died when he was young. He's been running that ranch on his own since he was 22. "How old is he now?" Violet asked. 28, said Mrs. Greer. "And before you ask, no, there has not been a woman out there since his father's time." Violet ate her stew and thought about this, and decided it was not the sort of information she needed to do anything with immediately. The thing that changed everything was the storm. It came in June, a genuine plain storm of the kind that the Kansas sky seemed to produce as a demonstration of what weather could become when it really applied itself. She was at the ranch when it arrived, a Saturday afternoon, and it came fast the way those storms do, the sky turning a greenish yellow in the west and the wind picking up from nothing to something remarkable in the space of 20 minutes. Cecil came to find her in the kitchen where she was baking bread, moving with a decisive urgency she had not seen in him before. "Storm coming," he said. "Big one. You should not ride home in it." She looked out the kitchen window at the sky, which had turned the color of a bruise. "All right," she said. "What needs doing?" "Horses need to be in the barn and secured," he said. "Chickens in. I need to weight down the tarps on the hay pile." "Tell me what to do," she said. He did quickly and clearly, and they moved through the next 20 minutes with efficient urgency, each taking half the tasks, working against the rising wind that was now audible, a low roar building from the west. She got Mabel and his chestnut and the two other horses into the barn, and got them secured in their stalls, speaking to them in a low, steady voice because they were nervous. She could feel it in the way they shifted, and she kept her own nerves out of her voice because the horses needed her to be calm, and so she was calm. When she came out of the barn with the last horse put away, the sky had gone nearly black, and the wind hit her like a physical thing, hard enough to stagger her, and she put her head down and moved toward the house, and Cecil was suddenly beside her, his hand at her elbow, steady and sure, and they went up the porch steps together and got inside just as the rain came, not as rain at first, but as something closer to a horizontal wall of water. They stood in the kitchen and listened to the storm assault the house, and the house hold firm, which it did, because it was well built, solid timber and good joinery, made to last by someone who had understood what Kansas weather could do. He built up the fire in the stove, and she put the bread in to finish baking, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and the storm worked itself through outside, impressive and loud and gradually, over the course of 2 hours, diminishing. They talked for those 2 hours in a way they had not talked before, without the outdoor context of horses and work and the wide open land around them. Just the two of them in the warm kitchen with the storm at the windows. He told her about his father, who had come from Virginia to Kansas in 1860 and built the ranch from raw land, who had been a patient and exacting man who believed in doing things correctly rather than quickly. He told her about learning to ranch from childhood, about how when his father died 3 years ago it had been both the worst and in some strange way the most clarifying thing that had happened to him, because he had understood that the ranch was his, and what he did with it was entirely his responsibility and his choice. She told him about her grandmother, her father's mother, who had been the only person in her family who had ever looked at her directly and talked to her as though her opinions were worth something, who had left her the inheritance, who had died when Violet was 19 and whose absence had felt like the closing of a door that Violet had not realized was the only door in the room. She would have liked it here, Violet said. She would have liked the sky. What was her name? Cecil asked. Ruth, said Violet. Ruth Conley. She was about 5 feet tall and she argued with every man she met and she was always right. He smiled at that, the full smile that changed his face. Sounds like someone else I know, he said. She looked at him across the table, and the storm was outside, and the fire was in the stove, and the bread was baking, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something is right. This specific and unrepeatable feeling, warm and serious and deep. Cecil, she said. Yes, he said. I came west to be free, she said. I want you to know that is still true. It is still the most important thing. He looked at her steadily, and she saw in his face the same quality she had seen the day he told her he would never cage her, that quiet certainty, that genuine comprehension of who she was. I know, he said. I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. Then what are you asking? She said. The question hung between them in the warm kitchen, and he sat with it for a real moment, not flinching from it, and then he said, I am asking if I might be part of the life you're building. Not the whole of it, not the cage of it, just a part. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Yes, she said, you might. The storm had gone entirely quiet outside by then, the way those storms do when they pass, leaving a silence so complete it was almost loud. And through the kitchen window the sky had cracked open in the west to show a narrow strip of evening gold. He walked her to the barn, and she saddled Mabel, and he stood in the barn door while she mounted. And as she turned the horse toward the road, he said her name once, and she looked back at him. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed, and rode home through the washed and glittering evening with her heart doing things she chose, for the moment, to simply allow. Tomorrow came, and then many tomorrows after it. And they were together in the particular way of two people who have been honest with each other from the beginning, which means they were together with space between them still, enough space for each of them to breathe in. And Violet found that this, more than anything, was what made it possible for her to let it be real. He never told her what she should do. When she made a decision about her school or her life in Harlow, he received it as information and not as a problem to be managed. When she was angry, which happened, because she had a temper that the polite restraint of Baltimore had merely compressed, and Kansas was allowing to decompress, he did not retreat or demand she contain herself. He listened and responded to the substance of what she was angry about, which was so extraordinary to her that the first time it happened she was briefly confused about how to proceed. It happened because of Josiah Plum, the mayor, who told her in August that the school board, consisting of himself and 2 other men, had decided the school hours should change to allow boys to be released earlier so they could help with harvest, which was reasonable enough, but that they were also thinking the girls' curriculum could be simplified since the girls would not be continuing their educations past a certain age in any case. She heard this and felt the old Baltimore walls start to lean inward, and she went home to Mrs. Greer's that evening tight with a fury she had nowhere to put. When she saw Cecil the following day, she told him about it, and he listened with complete attention, and when she was done he said, "That's wrong." "I know it's wrong," she said. "Then fight it," he said. "You know this better than I do. What do you need?" She stared at him. "I need to write a letter to the State Board of Education," she said, "and I need to find out who else in this town agrees with me." "Reuben Farr agrees with you," he said. "His wife has been trying to get her daughter into the secondary school in Dodge City and is furious about what's available here." "How do you know that?" "Reuben told me," he said. "He tells me things. It's useful." She laughed despite herself, and then she went and spoke to Mrs. Farr, who was indeed a formidable ally, and she wrote her letter, and she also spoke at the next town meeting with enough precision and force that Josiah Plum went very red in the face but ultimately could not produce a coherent counterargument. The curriculum was not simplified. She counted this as a victory, and felt, in the aftermath, more completely herself than she had perhaps ever felt. She told Cecil about it when she rode out to the ranch that Saturday. "Of course you won," he said. "You sound very certain," she said. "You were right," he said simply. "That tends to matter." She looked at him. In the months since the storm they had fallen into a rhythm that was easy and deep, and that had included, by this point, some evenings sitting on the porch, when the stars came out so thickly over the Kansas plain that the sky looked like someone had scattered salt across black velvet, and long rides out across the land he knew and was teaching her to know, and a great deal of talking and a great deal of comfortable silence. And one evening in July, when the sun was going down in a long orange arc, he had kissed her, very quietly, leaning against the fence at the south edge of his property, and she had kissed him back, and neither of them had said anything about it for a few minutes afterward. Just stood there in the warm evening air being honest with themselves. She loved him. She had been aware of this for some time now. She had not said it, and neither had he, and this was fine because they were both people who moved at their own speed, but the love was there, large and real and quiet, the way real things tend to be. The complication arrived in September, which was when she received a letter from Baltimore. It was from her father. He had, through some combination of inquiry and luck, located her in Harlow. The letter was written in his formal hand, the cursive of a man who had attended an excellent school and used this fact at every opportunity. He told her he had heard about her situation, that she was working as a schoolteacher in Kansas, that her behavior had embarrassed the family, that Aldous Farrell had not waited for her and had married a girl from Philadelphia in June, which she read with complete indifference, and that it was time for her to come home. He did not ask. He told, the same way he had always done. She sat with the letter at the kitchen table in Mrs. Greer's boarding house for a long time, and Mrs. Greer, who had a gift for knowing when to be present and when to leave a person alone, came and made tea and set it in front of her and went back to her own business. She was not going back. That was not even a question. The question was what she felt beneath the certainty, and what she felt was something she had not expected. Not fear, not anger, but a sadness that was old and familiar, and had nothing to do with her father himself so much as with the fact that she had spent a long time hoping to be known by him, and had finally understood that she was not going to be. That she was a fact about his life that did not fit his understanding of how life worked, and that he would spend whatever years remained to him trying to file her down to fit rather than expanding his understanding. She wrote back to him that evening. She was kind in the letter, because she believed in being kind even when it was hard, and she told him that she had found a life that was hers and that she wished him well in his, and that she hoped someday he would understand the difference between a daughter who has left and a daughter who has been set free. She did not expect him to understand it, but she meant it. She told Cecil about the letter the next Saturday, riding side by side along the eastern fence line, where the late September grass was turning the color of honey. She told him without making it smaller than it was, but also without making it larger, just the facts of it and what she felt about the facts. He listened. When she was finished, he said, "Are you all right?" Yes, she said, I think I am. It is sad in the way that things that are over are sad, but I am not going back. I know you're not, he said. She looked at him. You say things like that, she said, as though you simply know what I'm going to do. I do know, he said. I know who you are. She felt the weight of this, the simple and extraordinary weight of being known by another person, and she thought, here it is. This is the thing I came west for, though I did not know to call it this. Not just freedom, this too. They stopped at the top of a small rise where you could see for miles in every direction, the land going flat and golden to every horizon, and she looked out at all of it and felt her chest open wide. I love you, she said. She had not planned to say it then. It came out because it was true and she was done pretending otherwise. He turned to look at her. In the long October golden light, his face was everything she had come to understand it to be, honest and steady and capable of depth she was still discovering. He said, I have loved you since the creek. Which creek? She said. We have ridden past several creeks. The first one, he said, with the pale stones. She thought about it and smiled. That was quite early, she said. It was, he said. You were looking at the water and you said, I see it now, about the mare's leg, and I thought, there is a person who pays attention to things, and then I was finished. She laughed and then stopped laughing because his face was very sincere and she did not want him to think she was not taking it seriously. I am not laughing at the content, she said. Only the way you said it, as though you were reporting on the weather. I try to be accurate, he said. You are extremely accurate, she said. You are the most accurate man I have ever met. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he leaned over from his saddle, which required considerable balance, and kissed her, and she met him halfway, which also required balance, and the horses stood very still beneath them as though they understood something important was happening. She almost fell off Mabel. He caught her arm. They were both laughing when she had settled back into her seat. The horses looked mildly offended. I am still learning to ride, she reminded him. You're an excellent rider, he said. I distracted you. You did, she agreed. They rode back to the ranch in the gold and cooling afternoon, and he made coffee, and she finished the pie she had started that morning, with the last of the autumn apples she had bought from Reuben Farr, and they sat on the porch in the late afternoon, and were exactly what they were to each other, without complication or pretense or the need to be anything other than that. The autumn passed into winter. The Kansas winter was serious, nothing like the genteel cold of Baltimore that came with social engagements and fine wool coats and the pleasure of a well-heated drawing room. This was a cold that had opinions about you. The first hard freeze came in November, and she found that she loved it, the way the land went silent and still under it, the way the morning sky was the particular clear blue that only exists in winter, the way the fire in Mrs. Greer's stove made the boarding house feel like a small, warm world against all that enormous cold. She kept teaching through the winter. She kept riding out to the Vaughn ranch on Saturdays, bundled in the good wool coat she had bought at Reuben Farr's, her breath making clouds in the cold air, Mabel steady and reliable beneath her. Daniel Purdy had returned from Dodge City in October, his leg healed, and had resumed his work on the ranch. He was a young man of 20 with a quick smile and a forthright manner, and he regarded Violet with a frank respect that she found refreshing. He said once, helping her brush down Mabel after a ride, "Cecil is different since you came around. Better different, I mean. He always did his work fine, but he was pretty quiet inside himself. Not so much anymore." She did not tell Cecil he had said this, but she held it quietly, and it mattered. The proposal, when it came, was in December, the week before Christmas, which the town of Harlow celebrated with a community gathering at the church that involved a great deal of food and some genuine music from a fiddler named Pete Garrison who could make you want to dance even if you had decided you were not the dancing sort. It was after the gathering, walking back through the cold and empty street with Cecil, the stars extraordinary overhead, the whole world frozen and glittering and silent. He stopped in the middle of the street and she stopped beside him and looked up, because the stars were the kind you stopped for. He said her name. She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands, turning it once, which was the only nervous habit she had observed in him. "I told you I would never cage you," he said. "I need you to know that I mean that entirely. What I'm about to say doesn't change it." She looked at him and waited. "I would like to marry you," he said. "And I would like to be very clear that what that means to me is that we build something together, not that you fit yourself into something I already have. The ranch, the life, all of it, we can make it what we choose to make it. You keep your school. You keep your independence. You keep everything that is yours. I am only asking you to let me be beside you while you do." The stars were very bright. The street was very empty. The cold was very cold, and she did not feel it at all. "Yes," she said. "Cecil, yes." He put his hat back on his head and took her hands in his, both of them warm and sure. "All right," he said, which was the most Cecil Vaughn thing he could possibly have said, and she loved him entirely for it. They were married in February of 1879, which was cold and clear and bright, in the Harlow church with most of the town present, because a small town in Kansas in 1879 regarded a wedding as an event for everyone who cared to attend. Mrs. Greer cried with a dignity that suggested she found crying somewhat embarrassing, but was not going to deny herself the experience. Reuben Farr and his wife were there. Daniel Purdy was there, dressed in a clean shirt that appeared to be causing him discomfort. Josiah Plum was there, and shook Cecil's hand and told Violet she was a fine addition to the community, which she took as a peace offering and accepted graciously, because she had won the curriculum argument and could afford to be gracious. She wore a dress she had made herself, blue as the winter sky, because she had decided that white in the Kansas plains in February was a practical absurdity, and because she liked blue, and because it was her wedding and she was going to wear what she chose. Mrs. Greer had helped with the construction of it over several evenings of quiet industry at the boarding house, and it fit perfectly. Cecil, for his part, wore a clean black coat and a new hat and his good boots, and he stood at the front of the church with the composed steadiness that was his essential quality, and when she came through the door on nobody's arm because she had decided to walk herself, she saw his expression, that careful and serious and genuine face, and something broke open in her chest in the very best way. The minister read the words. She said yes. He said yes. It was done. The reception was held in the church hall and involved a great deal of food and Pete Garrison's fiddle, and some dancing that she had not expected to participate in but did because the fiddle was insistent and Cecil, it turned out, could dance, which was information she had not had before and which delighted her. "Why did you not tell me you could dance?" she demanded as they moved through something that resembled a reel. "You did not ask," he said. "I am asking now." "I learned from my father," he said. He said a man ought to be able to dance. It was one of 3 requirements he had for being a proper person. What were the other 2? "Keep your word and take care of your animals," he said. She thought about this and decided she agreed with all 3. They went back to the ranch that evening because it was her home now, and she had moved her trunk and her satchel and her books and Mabel from Mrs. Greer's the week before. She had arranged her books on a shelf Cecil had built for her in the parlor, and she had put her grandmother Ruth's small framed portrait on the mantel, and she had decided the kitchen garden would be considerably larger come spring. She stood in the parlor of the Vaughn ranch house, now her house, and looked at her grandmother's portrait on the mantel and thought, "I made it, Ruth. I found it. The open sky and the work that is mine, and the man who does not try to make me smaller. I made it." The first year of marriage was not without difficulty, because the first year of any marriage requires 2 people to learn to share a life in the practical and daily sense, which is different from sharing it in the occasional and romantic sense, and both of them had strong habits and specific ways of doing things that occasionally collided. She was accustomed to organizing her mornings with precision. She rose early, made coffee, worked for an hour on her school preparations before breakfast, and did not particularly want to talk until after the coffee. He was accustomed to rising early and immediately beginning the work of the ranch, which involved a certain amount of noise and movement that she had to learn to exist alongside at 5 in the morning. They negotiated. This was, she thought, one of the underrated skills of a marriage, the willingness to negotiate with genuine intention rather than with the performance of compromise. He agreed to take the noisier early morning tasks to the barn. She agreed to make enough coffee for two and leave it on the stove for when he came back in. These were small things. They made a large difference. She had been slightly worried privately about the loss of autonomy. She had been clear-eyed about the ways that marriage, even a good marriage, asked things of a woman in 1879 that it did not equally ask of a man. She had watched women she knew in Baltimore be absorbed into their marriages like sugar into water, present but no longer themselves. She had been determined that this would not happen to her. What she found, and what continued to surprise her, was that Cecil's essential commitment to her freedom was not a thing he said and then quietly walked back. It was how he actually was. When she wanted to go to Dodge City in the spring to look at the secondary school there, and to bring two of her most capable students who she thought could benefit from further education, he arranged for her to go and asked her to bring back a particular kind of iron hardware he needed for the barn, as though her absence for 4 days was simply a part of the ongoing fact of her life and not a disruption of anything. She brought back the hardware. She also brought back 2 books she had found at a bookseller in Dodge City, one of which was for him, a comprehensive guide to cattle breeding practices that she had identified from the description as useful to what he was trying to do with the herd. He read it with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and sometime later told her the breeding suggestions in Chapter 7 had been genuinely helpful. The summer of 1879 was hot and busy and good. Her school had grown to 14 students by fall. She had, with the cooperation of a less resistant Josiah Plum, arranged for 2 of her older girls to take correspondence courses from an institution in Topeka that was beginning to offer such things. She had expanded the kitchen garden and learned to preserve vegetables in the Kansas way for winter, which involved considerably more work than she had anticipated and a great deal of satisfaction in the result. She also learned, that summer, that she was going to have a child. She knew before she could be certain. She had been paying attention to herself for long enough to know what the change in her body meant. She sat with it for a week, which was perhaps longer than strictly necessary, partly to be sure and partly because she was understanding what it meant. She had not planned for this immediately. She was not distressed by it. She was something more complex than either planned or distressed. She was a woman who had built her freedom very carefully and was now discovering that life inside that freedom was moving in a direction she had not specifically charted, and she had to decide how she felt about this, not in terms of what she was supposed to feel, but in terms of what she actually felt. What she actually felt, she discovered, was that she wanted this. She wanted it in the same genuine and uncomplicated way she had wanted to come west, and she understood that wanting it was her own wanting, not something that had been decided for her, and that this made all the difference. She told Cecil on a Sunday evening in August, sitting on the porch in the long summer light. She told him plainly, because she did everything plainly. She watched his face as she said it and saw something happen there that was larger than his usual careful composure, something that came from a different depth. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling very well," she said. "Strong. A little tired in the mornings, but it passes." He nodded. Another silence, and then he said, "I am very glad, Violet." The way he said her name, with that quiet weight in it, was almost too much to be borne directly. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers, and they sat there in the long evening light and did not need to say anything else. She kept teaching through the autumn. The women of Harlow had opinions about this, divided between those who thought it was admirable and those who thought it was inappropriate, and she listened to both sides with equanimity and kept teaching, because she had discussed it with the mayor and the school board and the parents of her students, and the majority of them wanted her to continue, and she was going to continue. She was careful. She was sensible. She took care of herself, and the child the way she took care of everything, with attention and practicality, and Cecil made a thorough pest of himself inquiring after her comfort in the way of a man who is trying very hard not to be overbearing, but cannot entirely suppress his anxiety. She found this both touching and slightly exasperating, and told him both things, and he received them both without offense and scaled back the inquiries to a frequency she deemed acceptable. Their son was born in March of 1880, which in Kansas meant arriving into a world still cold and clear, the plains pale and wide outside the window of the bedroom in the ranch house, where the doctor from Harlow attended the birth. He was born in the early morning, before the sun was fully up, and his first cry filled the quiet house, and Violet heard it through the exhaustion and the effort, and felt something she had no adequate word for, something that was love but also recognition, as though she were meeting a person she had been expecting for some time. Cecil held him with an expression she had never seen on his face before and would never forget, open and undone in a way that all his steadiness could not contain, and she thought, "There you are. There is the man underneath all that composure, and he is exactly as good as I thought." They named the boy James after Cecil's father. James Arthur Vaughn, born on a cold March morning in Kansas, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's serious expression, and an appetite that suggested he had opinions about his needs, and intended to express them clearly. She went back to teaching in May, 2 months after James was born, which required some arrangements. Mrs. Greer came to the ranch 3 days a week, not because she needed to be paid, but because she had appointed herself James's unofficial grandmother, and this was not negotiable. Otis's wife, a solid and cheerful woman named B, took him the other 2 days. Violet fed him before school and at noon and in the evening, and during this period developed a sincere respect for mothers throughout all of human history who had done this while also doing everything else. James was a sturdy and even-tempered baby, which she took as a sign that the universe was being fair to her for once. He had his father's quality of watching the world with steady and interested attention, and his mother's tendency to have specific feelings about things and make them known. By the time he was 9 months old, he could communicate by volume and expression, and the determined pointing of one small finger exactly what he wanted, and Violet noted that he was already considerably more direct than most adults she had met. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, which means they were not without difficulty or loss or the ordinary sorrows that belong to any human existence, but they were full of work and purpose, and the deep comfort of a life that was genuinely hers. She made changes to the ranch house, not to erase what had been there but to add to it, a proper shelf of books in the parlor that grew through the years into something approaching a small library, her grandmother's portrait permanent on the mantel, curtains in the windows that she had made herself. She expanded the kitchen garden every year, so that by 1882 it was large enough that she was selling preserves to Reuben Farr's store, which was not something she had planned to do, but which had happened because she had more than they needed and waste offended her. Cecil built her a desk in the parlor, a proper one with drawers and a surface broad enough for her papers, because she had taken on the additional responsibility of writing the monthly school report for the State Board of Education and needed a proper place to do it. He built it over 2 weekends in the winter of 1881 with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and when it was done, he set it by the west window so she would have the light in the afternoon when she worked, which was a small thing and not a small thing at all. She noticed things about him across the years. She noticed that he was learning too, all the time, reading what he could find about better ranching practices, about new varieties of grass for the pasture, about cattle breeding, and that he spoke about these things with a genuine interest that was not performance. She noticed that he was quietly generous in ways he did not announce, that when a homesteader family 20 miles north had a terrible drought year, Cecil arranged for them to receive feed for their animals without making them ask for it and without making them feel beholden. She noticed that he was a good father, not in the sentimental sense but in the real sense, that he was present and consistent and took James seriously as a person, even when James was very small, and his opinions were primarily about his hat or a particular stick he had found. She loved him more as the years went on, which was not what people in Baltimore had implied love was supposed to do. They had implied it was a thing that peaked and then stabilized, a kind of fondness after the initial intensity. What she found was that love, in the right conditions, did not peak and stabilize. It deepened. It became something more complex and more sure, like a river that is both faster and broader further from its source. In 1883, their daughter was born. They named her Ruth, because Violet had always intended, if she had a daughter, to give her that name. Ruth Conley Vaughn, because she had her mother's name in the middle, because Violet had decided this was how it would be and Cecil had said, of course, as though there were no other possibility. Ruth arrived in the world with what appeared to be already formed opinions about her situation, loudly expressed. She was smaller than James had been, but gave the impression of requiring more space. She had Cecil's coloring and Violet's manner, and by the time she was walking she had both of her parents entirely wrapped around her smallest finger, which James regarded with an air of philosophical acceptance. The household in those years was warm and busy and specific, full of the rhythms of school and ranch and seasons, and the children's particular needs and Violet's ongoing professional commitments, which had expanded to include helping to organize an effort to establish a public library in Harlow, which took 3 years of the kind of patient and determined effort that she had by now become very good at. When the library was finally established in the autumn of 1885, with a room in the back of the new town hall, 37 books on the initial shelves, and a catalog system she had designed herself, Violet stood in the middle of it and looked at the books and thought of her grandmother. She had written to her father once more, in 1882, a longer letter, telling him about James and about her life. He had written back, a letter that was stiff and formal and contained one sentence she had read many times afterward. "I suppose you have made something there." It was not an apology. It was not reconciliation. But she thought it was, from him, as close to acknowledgment as he was capable of, and she accepted it as such. He died in the winter of 1884 from pneumonia. She received the news by telegram and sat with it for a day, grieving not the man she had had but the man she had wished he could be, and then she let it settle into its proper place, which was the past, and went forward. The library was one of the things she was most proud of, but the school remained the center of her professional life. By 1885, the school had grown enough to require a second teacher, a young woman named Clara Baines who had come from Missouri, and whom Violet took on and trained with the same direct competence that had characterized everything she did professionally. Clara was 21 and sharp and eager, and Violet told her, on her first week, that she had the right to her own opinions about pedagogy, and that disagreement was welcome as long as it was reasoned. Clara Baines stayed in Harlow for the rest of her life. She married a carpenter named Tom Elliott in 1887 and named her first daughter Violet, which made the original Violet press her lips together and look at the ceiling to collect herself. The summer of 1886 was one she would remember long afterward. James was 6 by then, going to school himself, which produced a kind of doubling that she found both amusing and strange, to be both teacher and mother of a student. He was a serious and capable student, which she tried very hard not to take particular pride in but did. Ruth was 3, and at the stage where her curiosity about the world exceeded any practical capacity to manage it, so that she required a degree of vigilance from everyone around her, and rewarded this vigilance by being entirely charming about everything she managed to get into. Cecil had expanded the ranch by that point, buying the adjacent acreage from a homesteader who had decided Kansas was not for him, and selling it back to someone who was going to farm it rather than leaving it to dry up. The herd was larger, the fences better, the barn rebuilt 2 years prior to be twice its original size. He had hired 2 additional hands, and the operation ran with the reliable efficiency of something built by a man who did what he said he was going to do and expected the same from those around him. She sometimes stood at the window of the parlor in the evenings when the children were in bed and Cecil was reading in the chair by the fire, and thought about the woman she had been on that train platform in Harlow, pulling her hair down from its pins. She thought about what that woman had wanted, what she had feared, what she had hoped for. She thought she would have liked this. She would have looked at this and known it was right. She thought, it is not what I expected, because I had not let myself expect anything this specific, anything this whole. I expected to be free. I did not know that freedom could have this inside it. She said something of this to Cecil one evening in the summer of 1886, sitting on the porch in the long, warm dusk, the children's voices still just audible from the yard where James was teaching Ruth some game with sticks that she was applying to with intense concentration. She said she had been thinking about who she was when she arrived. He said, "What were you thinking?" she said. "That I came here to be free, and I found that. And then I found you inside that freedom, which was not what I expected." He looked at her across the porch in the summer evening. He said, "I hope that was not a disappointment." She said, "It was the opposite of a disappointment. It was the thing that made the freedom complete." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had done thousands of times by then, and held it in the particular way he had, not possessive, not performative, just present, just his hand around hers. "I told you I would never cage you," he said. "You told me that at the creek," she said, "with the pale stones." "I meant it then and I mean it now," he said. "I know," she said. "I have always known." James came running around the corner of the house then. Ruth clutched under his arm like a sack of grain because she had, apparently, required assistance with some part of the game, and she was absolutely outraged about the method of transport and expressing this loudly and comprehensively. Cecil stood up and took Ruth from James and held her against his chest, where she continued to express her views for another 30 seconds before switching suddenly to showing him something she had in her fist, which turned out to be a beetle she had found, which she appeared to regard as a significant discovery. He examined the beetle with sincere interest. He said, "Good find, Ruth." She nodded emphatically, as though this confirmed her view of the matter. James sat on the porch step and explained, with the dignity of a 6-year-old who has been reasonable and does not feel this is being sufficiently appreciated, that Ruth had not wanted to cooperate with the game, and he had been trying to move her to a better position. Violet listened to this explanation with the serious attention it deserved and told him that people did not generally appreciate being carried without being asked, even in service of a better position. He considered this. Even when it would help them, he said. Even then, she said. He sat with this information for a moment. "That seems inefficient," he said. "It is," she said, "but it is how people are." He accepted this with the philosophical air that was characteristic of him. Cecil caught her eye over the top of Ruth's head, and the small shared amusement between them was its own kind of intimacy, the accumulated understanding of parents who know each other and know their children and can speak volumes in a look. The years moved on in the way of good years, which is to say they moved both quickly and fully, so that looking back there seemed to be more in them than time strictly allowed. The school became one of the better rural schools in that part of Kansas, which Violet pursued with the same methodical determination she brought to everything, writing to the state board, acquiring better materials, advocating for her students with a patient but inflexible persistence that Josiah Plum had long since given up trying to moderate. James grew into a tall and serious boy who had his father's quality of steadiness and his mother's quality of precision, and who, by the time he was 10, was helping with real work on the ranch in the way of a child who has grown up knowing that work is what life is made of. Ruth grew into a girl who seemed to regard every rule as a starting point for negotiation, which Violet found both exasperating and thoroughly recognizable, and who had her father's particular capacity for real attention when something captured her interest, which it did constantly. In the autumn of 1888, Violet turned 33 and Cecil turned 38. James was 8 and Ruth was 5. The Vaughn ranch was established and solid. The Harlow school was thriving. The library had 62 books. One evening in October, which was her favorite month in Kansas, the light honey gold and the air cool, and carrying the smell of the turned fields and the dry grass, she and Cecil rode out to the east fence line as they sometimes did in the evenings, not for any particular reason of ranch management, but because they liked to, because the ride and the view and the time together was its own sufficient reason. They stopped at the rise where you could see for miles, as they had the first time she had said she loved him, and sat on their horses and looked at the land going wide and amber to the horizon. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me at the creek? The first time we talked there with the pale stones." "I remember," he said. "I think about it still," she said. "I have thought about it many times over the years, that you said it so simply as though it were obvious, as though of course that was how things would be." "It was obvious," he said. "To me it was." She looked at him in the October light. She had loved him for 10 years by now, and she thought she understood what that meant in a way she had not understood when she first felt it. That love over time becomes not less but more. That it settles into something you can rest your whole weight on. That the space between two people who love each other well is not empty but full. Full of every conversation and every silence and every year and every ordinary and extraordinary day. "I want you to know," she said, "that everything I hoped for when I came west I found it. All of it. And I want you to know that you are a part of all of it, not the cage of it, but the very best part of the freedom of it." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking what she had said seriously and not rushing past it. Then he said, "Violet, I know that what I said to you at the creek about never caging you was the right thing to say because it was the truth. But I want you to know that you have never asked me to be less than what I am either. You have never made me smaller to make yourself larger. I want you to know I know that." She had not expected this, and it moved her, the way things from him had been moving her for a decade without diminishing. She blinked and looked at the horizon and then back at him. "We are very good together," she said. "We are," he said. "We are very good together." The horses stood in the evening quiet, and the light turned from gold to rose, and they sat in it, unhurried, in the particular way of two people who have built something together and know it and are not done building. She reached over in the way she had done at the creek, that first afternoon, to steady herself on his arm, and this time she did not need to steady herself at all, but did it anyway, because some gestures accrue meaning over time and become their own kind of language. He put his hand over hers. The sun went lower and the sky behind it went colors that no painting had yet adequately captured, deep rose and copper, and a line of pure gold along the edge of the earth. And above it all the Kansas sky, enormous and deep and absolutely clear, going to blue and then darker blue, and then the first stars beginning. They rode home in the dusk, the horses finding their way easily on a familiar road, and the light in the ranch house windows was warm and visible from a long way off, a signal of exactly what it was. People here, fire here, home here. James had started supper, because he was 8 and had decided this was within his capabilities, and the evidence of this was both promising and slightly alarming. Ruth was at the kitchen table drawing something elaborate with a piece of charcoal she had obtained from some source she declined to specify. The house smelled of wood smoke and food, and the particular warm smell of a lived-in place in autumn. Cecil took over the supper with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been cooking for himself since he was 22, and Violet sat at the kitchen table beside Ruth and looked at her drawing, which appeared to be a horse with an extremely detailed mane and a sun that had grown large enough to encompass half the picture. "What is the horse's name?" Violet asked. Ruth considered this with great seriousness. "Clementine," she said. "Good name," said Violet. Ruth nodded, satisfied, and added another detail to the mane. They ate supper together at the kitchen table as they always did, the four of them, with the conversation that a family of this particular composition produced. James asking questions about things that required real answers, because he could always tell when he was being given a simplified version, and objected to it. Ruth announcing things she had decided with the authority of someone who does not yet know that things she has decided can be revised. Cecil providing information with his characteristic precision. Violet listening and responding, and watching her family with the quiet and total pleasure of someone who has exactly what she wanted without having known, at the beginning, that she was capable of wanting something so specific. After supper, James went to his room to read, and Ruth fell asleep in Cecil's arms in the parlor, her charcoal-smudged face peaceful against his shoulder, and Violet took her upstairs and put her in her bed, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the room looking at her sleeping daughter. She went back downstairs and found Cecil in the parlor by the fire with a cup of coffee, and the cattle breeding book she had bought him years ago in Dodge City, which he returned to periodically as though it were a text that yielded new meaning with each reading. She sat across from him in the other chair and took up her own book, a history of the Western territories she had been reading in pieces over the past month, and they sat in the firelit quiet in the way they had done hundreds of evenings, and the fire burned down and the night went on, and the vast Kansas sky was outside full of stars they could not see through the walls but knew were there. She looked up from her book at some point and looked at him, and he looked up at the same moment and looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing they needed to say, everything having been said over the course of 10 years in ways both spoken and unspoken. She thought, this is what I came west for. This big sky and this work that is mine, and this man who looked at me at a creek with pale stones and understood without being told that what I needed most was to be free, and who built his love for me in that space and not against it. She thought, I am free and I am loved, and these are not opposite things. They were never opposite things. Someone who loves you right builds you more of what you need rather than less of it, and the right person's love makes you more yourself, not less. She thought of the woman on the train platform pulling the pins from her hair, and she thought, look what she found. Look where she arrived. She went back to her book. He went back to his. The fire burned. The house held. The night was large and full of stars. In the spring of 1889, they planted the kitchen garden together for the first time, both of them on their knees in the turned earth with the morning cool and the sky enormous and blue overhead, James helping with the officious precision of an 8-year-old who has read about gardening and has opinions, Ruth helping with the cheerful imprecision of a 5-year-old who finds dirt interesting for its own sake. Violet worked her way down the row with the ease of someone who has done this many times and knows what will come up from what she puts in the ground, and she thought, yes, this too, all of this. Cecil passed her a handful of bean seeds from the paper packet, and their hands met in the middle, and stayed that way for a moment longer than strictly necessary for the passing of seeds, and she felt the same thing she had felt at the creek 10 years ago. The deep and undiminished rightness of him. Next year, James said from his end of the row, not looking up from his own planting, with the manner of someone making a practical suggestion, we should try the new corn variety that Mr. Farr was telling Father about. We will look into it, Cecil said. I have already read about it, said James. Then you can tell me what you found, said Cecil. James straightened up and immediately began to explain what he had found with thoroughness. Ruth listened for approximately 15 seconds before finding a large earthworm that required her full attention. The garden grew. The summer came on in its full Kansas heat and abundance. The school year ended and began again. The library added books. The ranch prospered. The children grew taller and more themselves with each season. And Violet Conley Vaughn, who had come west to be free, lived freely in the widest and most complete sense of the word. Free in her work and her choices and herself, and loved within that freedom by a man who had understood from the beginning that the greatest thing he could offer her was not his protection, but his respect, not his shelter, but his presence, not a cage built of good intentions, but an open hand extended toward everything she was and everything she intended to become. The stars over Kansas were very bright that spring. They were always very bright. And under them, on the Vaughn Ranch 6 miles east of Harlow, a woman who had once stood on a train platform pulling pins from her hair looked up at them through the parlor window and felt the fullness of a life she had chosen fill her from the ground up, and was, in all the ways that counted, entirely, irrevocably, perfectly free.